"Marry me or don't," he said. "Either way, the land stays in your name, and nobody takes the schoolhouse from you." He said it with his hat still on, the way he said everything. Between them on the plank table lay a folded survey map, creased soft as cloth from being carried in a coat pocket for 11 days. A tin cup of coffee had gone cold beside it. Outside, March was coming apart into mud, and the whole valley smelled like snowmelt and cut pine. She did not answer him right away. "That is the part I keep coming back to, and the part I want you to hold on to. Stay with this one all the way to the end, and then tell me the exact moment you knew she was going to be all right." Her name was Marilla Lambert, and she was 32 years old, which in Cedar Hollow, Wyoming territory, had already been decided out loud, in public, by women who meant her no particular harm. Too old for courting, too old for a wedding dress. They said it kindly, the way you say a thing you consider settled, over a table of pie plates at the Pruitt place, not troubling to lower their voices, because they did not imagine she would mind. She taught the town's children their letters, and boarded alone in the room above the schoolhouse, and she owned, by her own name and her own filing, 40 acres of grass and creek bottom that had come to her in a way she never explained to anyone. Then the railroad wanted a right-of-way through the valley, and the woman they sent to get it was named Gertrude Quillfeather. She was pleasant, she was patient, she was never once rude. She simply explained to the county commissioners that a strip of Marilla Lambert's land was necessary for progress, and that the company was prepared to be generous, and the number she wrote down was a fraction of what the ground was worth. A spinster schoolteacher with no husband, no family, and no money for a lawyer was the softest place in that valley to press. Gertrude Quillfeather knew it. She had made a career of knowing it. So Marilla stood to lose the only 40 acres that had ever had her name on them, and with them the last thing that made her something other than a woman the town tolerated. Why would a quiet man, a bearded rancher of 36, who had been left standing at an altar once in front of the entire county and had not courted a soul since, why would he look at the one woman everybody had already written off and offer her the one thing she had never been given for free, which was a roof and a future with no conditions attached to it? Before we go back to the beginning, tell me where you are watching from tonight. I like knowing who is out there by the fire with me. 7 months earlier, the valley was gold and dry, and nobody in Cedar Hollow had ever heard the name Gertrude Quillfeather. It was the second Saturday of October, and the Pruitts were raising a barn. The whole county came out for it, the way they did, because a barn is the one thing a man cannot build alone, and everyone knows it. Wagons stood in the stubble field with their tongues down. There were 14 men up on the frame by mid-morning, and the sound of them was the sound she would remember later when she tried to remember that autumn at all, hammers going irregular, like rain that could not make up its mind. Marilla Lambert was down below with the women, cutting bread. She had come in the Pruitt wagon because she owned no horse, and she had brought what a schoolteacher on a schoolteacher's pay could bring, which was 2 loaves and a crock of apple butter she had put up herself in September. She set them on the plank table with everything else, between a ham and 4 pies, and she understood exactly how small her offering looked there. She had understood it before she left the schoolhouse. She brought it anyway. That is a kind of courage, though nobody in that field would have called it one. She was 32 years old that October. She wore her good gray dress, which was also her only dress that was not the one she taught in. Her hands were dry from chalk and from lye. She had a plain face and a straight back, and a way of standing very still when she was uncertain, which most people mistook for composure. Her origin was as plain as her face. She had been raised in a foundling home in Pittsburgh, given a bed, given a Bible, given the surname Lambert by a matron who wrote it in the ledger, and then told her, in front of the other girls, to be grateful for it. She had been grateful for it. She had also never once in 32 years been able to say the name out loud without hearing that woman's voice underneath it. Nobody in Cedar Hollow knew that part. She had never seen a reason to hand it to them. The morning went the way those mornings go. Coffee boiled over. A dog got into the ham and was chased off with a dish towel. Somebody's baby was passed hand to hand down the length of the table like a bucket at a fire. Marilla sliced bread and salted potatoes and kept the water pail full, and she was useful. And being useful was the closest thing to belonging that the town had ever offered her, and she had learned to take it. Then the pie plates came out, and she went around the back of the wagon to scrape a scorched pan, and she heard her name. It was Ada Pruitt talking, and one of the Hollis women with her, and they were not being cruel. Understand that, because it matters. They were being kind in the way people are kind about a thing they consider finished. "She teaches beautifully," Ada Pruitt said. "I only mean it is a shame nobody spoke for her at 20. "She is 32, the Hollis woman said. "That is past courting. You cannot put a woman of 32 in a wedding dress and expect anybody to keep a straight face." There was a small pause, the kind that means agreement. Ada Pruitt said, "It is settled then, and I do not think she minds. Some women are made for it. She has her letters and her 40 acres, and she seems content enough." Marilla stood behind the wagon with a scorched pan in her hands and did not move for what must have been 11 seconds. Not a gasp, not a tear. Just the sound of hammers going up on the frame and the pan going cool against her fingers, and the very careful business of deciding what her face would look like when she walked back around into view. She walked back around. She set the pan on the table. She asked if anyone wanted more coffee. "I want you to sit with how ordinary that was." There was no scene. Nobody meant her harm. Two women who liked her had simply said out loud, over pie plates, the thing the whole valley had already agreed on in private, and the agreeing was the injury, and there was no one to be angry at. You cannot go to war with a consensus. You can only teach its children their letters and keep your hands busy. That is what she had been doing for 4 years. She had a room above the schoolhouse, 12 feet by 14, with a stove that drew badly and a window that looked out on the road. She had 40 acres of grass and creek bottom filed in her own name, the one thing in her life that had come to her clean, and she rode out to walk it maybe 6 times a year and stood there feeling something she did not have a word for. She had a Sunday pew, third from the back, on the aisle, which she had chosen because it meant nobody had to slide past her to sit down, and nobody had to decide whether to, and she had made her peace with it, genuinely. Or she believed she had, which for most of us is the same thing until something comes along and tests it. By 4 o'clock, the barn had a roof on the east half, and the light was going long and orange across the stubble. The women started packing. Marilla carried the empty crocks and the wash pail down to the pump, alone, because it was the sort of work nobody thanks you for, and therefore nobody fights you for. The pump handle was stiff. She got it going, and she filled the pail, and when she lifted it she knew immediately that she had filled it too full, and that she was going to have to carry it 40 yards uphill across ground churned to ruts by wagon wheels in her good gray dress in front of everybody. A hand came into the edge of her vision and took the bale out of her fingers. She had not heard him come up. That was the first thing she learned about Duncan Mackenzie before she learned his name, that he could cross soft ground without announcing it. He was 36 years old, bearded, hat on. He had been up on the frame all day, and there was sawdust in his sleeve cuffs and on the crown of the hat, and he did not take it off to speak to her, and later she would understand that he almost never did. He lifted the pail and set off up the slope with it as if he had been sent for it, which he had not. She followed. She said, "I could have managed that." "I know," he said. That was all. Not a joke about the weight of it. Not a comment on her dress or her hands or her being a woman alone at the pump. Just 2 words, delivered forward, over his shoulder, without any weight on them at all. He set the pail on the tail of the Pruitt wagon, exactly where it needed to go, and then he looked at the near wheel for a second, crouched, and put his shoulder against the hub, and worked the hub nut a quarter turn tighter with his hand. He did not mention it. He did not point it out to her, or to Pruitt, or to anyone. He stood up, touched the brim of the hat, and walked back down toward the barn. Marilla Lambert stood beside a water pail in the failing light and watched him go. And this is what she noticed, the things she would turn over that night in the room above the schoolhouse with the stove drawing badly. He had not asked her anything. Every other person at that potluck who spoke to her had asked her something. How the children were coming along, whether she was warm enough up over the school. Whether she had heard about the Hollis girl's engagement, said gently, the way you offer weather to someone who cannot go outside. Kind questions, all of them, and every single one of them a small, polite reminder of what she was and what she was not. He had asked her nothing. He had taken the pail because it was heavy and tightened a wheel because it was loose, and then he had gone back to work. Riding home in the wagon bed with the Crocs between her knees, she asked Ada Pruitt who the bearded man was, the one who had been on the east end of the frame. Ada Pruitt said, "Mackenzie, Duncan Mackenzie, runs cattle up the North Fork." And then she said, in the same easy tone she had used behind the wagon, "He was left standing at the altar 4 years back, in front of the whole county. Never courted since. Some folks are just made for the quiet." Marilla looked out at the road going dark and did not answer. "The water pail is where it starts, so that is where I want you to look first." 10 days after the barn raising, on a Tuesday morning in late October, Marilla Lambert came down the outside stairs from her room with the school key in her hand and found firewood stacked against the schoolhouse wall. Not a load dumped off a wagon. Stacked. Split fine, the way you split for a stove that draws badly, ends squared off, the whole rick tucked up under the eave where the snow would not find it, maybe half a cord. Somebody had knelt in the frost to do the bottom course because the frost was printed with the shape of a knee. She stood in the cold with her breath going up and did the arithmetic, because she had been doing arithmetic on other people's kindness her whole life. The school board allowed her $4 a term for fuel. $4 bought a wagon load of green cottonwood that hissed and smoked and went out. She had been burning it since the first week of October and had already, twice, taught her afternoon class in her coat. She asked that day in the careful roundabout way a woman asks when she cannot afford to be wrong about who owes what to whom. She asked the Pruitt boys if their father had sent wood. She asked at Hollis's store whether the board had voted her anything extra. Hollis looked up from his ledger and said no, and looked back down, and there was something in the way he did not linger on it. Nobody claimed it, so she burned it, and the room over the school was warm for the first time in 4 years, and she felt guilty about that in a way she could not have explained to a living soul. Thursday, the pail. She had left it on the step, empty, upside down, the way she always left it so it would not fill with rain. When she came out at first light, it was standing right side up, full to about 3 inches from the rim, which is exactly the level a person fills a pail to if they intend somebody else to be able to carry it. And it had been set back precisely where she left it. Not near, not close enough. On the same square of plank, in the same worn ring, the bottom of it had made in the wood over 4 winters. That is the detail that undid her, and I want you to notice why. Anybody can be generous. Setting a thing back exactly where you found it is a different act altogether. It says, I was not here. It says, nothing of yours has been moved. It says, you do not owe me a thank you because there is nothing for you to have noticed. She noticed. She went down to the store on Saturday for chalk and lamp oil, and Duncan Mackenzie was outside it, loading grain sacks onto a wagon that was not his, hat on, sawdust gone from his cuffs, and flour dust in its place. He had one sack up on his shoulder, and he was walking it forward with that quiet-footed way of his, and when he saw her, he stopped and stood aside so she could come up the step, and he said, Ma'am. She said, Mr. Mackenzie. That was the whole conversation. She went in and bought her chalk and a quart of lamp oil, and when she set her coins on the counter, Hollis pushed 2 of them back at her and said the oil was on the school's account this month. She said, the school does not have an account. Hollis said, it does now, and turned the ledger a half turn away from her and asked whether she wanted the good chalk or the cheap chalk, which is a merchant's way of closing a subject. She took the cheap chalk. She was not going to be handled. Walking back up the road with the oil against her hip, she thought about the fact that a rancher from the North Fork was loading somebody else's grain on a Saturday, and about a store account that had appeared out of nowhere, and she filed both away without a conclusion, because she had learned young that guessing at the shape of a favor is how you end up in debt for one you never received. Another small thing she noticed that same week. To come from the North Fork into Cedar Hollow, a man had to cross Salt Creek at the ford below the bend. In October, the ford was low and easy, but it was 4 extra miles that way, and the short way was over the ridge, and the ridge came down into the far end of town, nowhere near the schoolhouse. Whoever was stacking her wood was coming the long way. The first snow came the second week of November, a wet one that broke branches. The stove smoked all Monday, and Tuesday she took the class outside for their reading so they would not sit in it, and Tuesday night, sometime between when she blew out her lamp and when the sky went gray, somebody climbed the outside stairs, took down 2 joints of her stovepipe, cleaned the elbow, reset it with fresh wire, and went away again. She slept through the whole of it. That is the part I still find remarkable. He worked 12 feet from her bed, and she never woke, which tells you something about how he worked, and possibly something about how tired a woman gets teaching 31 children in a cold room. In the morning, her stove drew like a chimney in a hotel. There was a length of old stovepipe wire coiled neatly on the rail. Nothing else out of place. Her hairbrush, her Bible, the tin of matches, all sitting where they had been. That was the pattern for the rest of November, and I am going to walk you through it slowly because the accumulation is the whole story. Twice a week, the wood, Tuesday and Friday before light. She never once caught him at it. She tried, twice. The first time she sat up in the dark with a shawl over her knees until 2 in the morning and fell asleep in the chair and woke at 6 to a full rick. The second time she deliberately made noise on the stairs at 5, and there was nobody there, and the wood was already stacked, and she understood then that he was coming earlier than any reasonable hour, before his own work, in the cold, over the long way across the ford. The pail, every morning it was empty, filled to 3 inches from the rim, set back in its own ring. The hinge on the schoolhouse door, which had squealed since 1879 as far as anyone knew, went silent one night in the 3rd week of November. She found a bright bead of oil on the pin and the smell of it on her fingers, and that afternoon a child asked her why the door had stopped talking, and she said, I suppose it got tired, and the child accepted that because children accept the world. Another small thing she noticed. He never came inside. Not once. The hinge got oiled from the porch side. The stovepipe got worked from the landing. He had been on her stairs in the dark, alone, with the door not even locked, because nobody in Cedar Hollow locked anything, and he had never turned the knob. So she began, in her turn, to leave things on the step. The first was a crock of the September apple butter, the last one she had, set out Monday night with a scrap of paper under the lid that said, "For whoever it is." She did not sign it. She was as stubborn as he was. Tuesday morning the crock was gone, and the wood was there. The following Tuesday the crock came back, washed, dried, and set right side up on the same plank as the pail. She stood on her landing at 6:30 in the morning with a clean, empty crock in both hands and laughed out loud. Once, a short, unbecoming sound, and then put her hand over her mouth like a girl in church. There was nobody on the road to hear it. The valley was white to the ridgeline, and the smoke was going up straight out of every chimney in town, and Marilla Lambert, who had been told out loud in October that she was past courting, stood there holding a washed crock and could not stop smiling. Watch what she does next, because it is the bravest thing she had done in 4 years. She baked. Wednesday night, in a room 12 feet by 14, on a stove that now drew properly, she made 2 loaves, and she left one of them on the step under a cloth. And she did not put a note on it at all this time, because a note is a question, and questions were the one thing that man had never asked her. The loaf went. The wood came. And that was the ritual all through the winter. Bread out, wood in. Pail empty, pail full. Crock out, crock back, washed. Neither of them ever once said a word about any of it in daylight. The Saturdays were the other half. She had chalk to buy, and lamp oil, and every so often a slate. He had grain to move, or a harness to have stitched, or nothing at all that she could see. But he was outside Hollis's store most Saturdays between 10 and noon, and she was inside it, and coming and going they passed each other on that one step. The first Saturdays it was Ma'am and Mr. Mackenzie and nothing else. By the end of November it was cold. Cold, she agreed. Roads will go by Thursday. They did go on Thursday. He had been right, and it had not sounded like a prediction when he said it, only like a man reading a page in front of him. By the first week of December she carried her own parcels out, and he stood aside for her, and once, when the step was iced, he put a hand out flat, not touching her, just there in the air beside her elbow, the way you steady a thing without laying hold of it. She came down the step. Her sleeve passed within an inch of his palm. Their hands almost touched. Almost. Neither of them mentioned it, and she thought about that inch of air for 3 days. Now, the mittens. This is the one I want you to remember. The church ladies held a sale the Saturday before Christmas for the school fund, and Marilla, who had no money to give, gave what she had, which was work. She had knitted through November and into December by lamplight after the copybooks were marked. 11 pairs of mittens, child-sized, gray and brown, and 1 pair in red because a scrap of red yarn had come her way. She set them out on the trestle at the back of the hall, behind the pies and the preserves and the Hollis girls' crocheted collars, and she priced them at 15 cents, and she stood beside the table the way you do when you are afraid nobody will come. At 2 o'clock, Duncan Mackenzie came down the hall with his hat in his hand, which was the first time she had seen him without it, and his hair was flattened where the band had been, and he looked younger and more exposed, and he clearly knew it. He looked at the mittens. He counted them with his finger, not touching them, moving down the row. He said, "I will take all of them." She said, "There are 11 pairs." He said, "I can count." She said, "Mr. Mackenzie, you do not have any children." And he said, "No, but the school does." Then he put money on the trestle, not 15 cents a pair. He put down $1.75, which was more than the whole table had taken all afternoon, and he gathered the 11 pairs into his hat like a man gathering eggs, and he said, "You will want to hand them out yourself. Nobody needs to know where they came from," and he walked out. The Monday after Christmas, 31 children came into that schoolhouse, and 11 of them, the 11 whose hands had been cracked and red since November, went home wearing mittens, and not one of them ever knew, and neither did their mothers, and neither did Ada Pruitt, who remarked in January that the schoolteacher must be spending her whole salary on those children, and that it was a shame she had nothing else to spend it on. No speech, no claiming, just 11 pairs of mittens carried out of a church hall in the crown of a hat. The blizzard came the second week of January and shut the valley for 3 days. Wind out of the northwest, snow moving sideways, no school, no church, no road. She stayed in her room with her books and her stove and rationed the wood because she had a rick and a half under the eave and no way to know how long 3 days would turn into. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind quit. She opened her door onto a world scoured white and silent and found the rick built back up to the eave boards, a fresh half-cord, snow already dusting the top of it. He had crossed the Salt Creek ford in that, before light, to stack wood for a woman he had never once spoken to for longer than a minute. She sat down on the top step in the cold with her hands in her lap. She did not cry. That is not who she was. She sat there and let herself be warm about it for a while, and then she went in and made coffee, and that is how the last part of the ritual began, because from that morning on, she got up early, not to catch him, to be ready. She left a tin cup of coffee on the step, covered with a saucer, hot at 5 in the morning. The first day it was untouched and cold by 7, and she felt foolish. The second day it was empty, rinsed, and set upside down on the plank next to the pail. The third day she was standing in her doorway when he came up the stairs with an armload of split pine. He stopped 4 steps down, snow on his shoulders, hat on. She said, "It is warmer inside." He said, "I know," and he stayed on the stairs. So she came out onto the landing in her shawl, and he set the wood down and took the cup, and the two of them stood in the dark at 5 in the morning, 11 feet from a stove, and drank coffee outdoors in January, and I have thought about that a great deal, and I have decided it was not shyness. It was carefulness. There is a difference, and by then she knew it. That became the pattern for the rest of the winter. Tuesday and Friday, 5 o'clock, 2 people standing on a landing in the cold. He talked about weather, and cattle and the ford. She talked about the children, and then about books, and then about Pittsburgh, a little, in pieces, more than she had told anyone in Cedar Hollow in 4 years. She told him about the foundling home. She told him about the ledger and the matron and being handed a surname and told to be grateful for it, and he did not say anything comforting, which was a mercy, and he did not say anything at all for a while, and then he said, "Lambert is a good name. You have made it one." She had to turn and look at the road for a minute after that. There were things she did not tell him. There was a front room in Pittsburgh with a brass plate on the door and a man in it who read law and to whom she had been engaged for 2 years and 4 months, and whose deeds and affidavits and condemnation notices she had copied out in her own hand until she knew the shape of every clause in them better than he did. She never mentioned that man. Not once, all winter. But in February she stood in Hollis's store reading a legal notice pinned by the door about a tax sale, and she caught herself thinking that the description of the parcel was defective and would not hold, and she stepped back from the wall as if it had been hot. Another small thing she noticed, that same February. She had been watching him for 4 months, and she had never once seen him take an order from anybody. Men brought him ledgers on the store step and stood while he read them. The mill sent word to the North Fork twice that winter by boy on a mule, and the school's account at Hollis's, which she had never opened and never signed for, was never once presented to her. She did not ask. With him, she could never be entirely sure, and she found that she did not mind. On the last Friday in February, he handed her the empty cup, and she reached for it, and his glove came off the tin at the same moment her fingers closed on it, and the backs of their hands passed each other in the dark, half an inch apart. No more. Almost. He said, "Snow will go by the middle of March. Creek will come up hard." She said, "It always does." He said, "Ford washes out every spring. Strands folks a week." Then he put his hat brim down against the wind and went down the stairs, and she stood on the landing with a warm tin cup in both hands and the first thin gray coming up over the ridge, and she had no way in the world of knowing that in 11 weeks a pleasant woman with a folded map and a company behind her would ride into Cedar Hollow and put a number on the only 40 acres that had ever carried Marilla Lambert's name. The snow went by the middle of March, exactly as he had said it would, and the creek came up hard, and the ford below the bend washed out and stranded the mail a week. 11 weeks after that last Friday in February, a woman rode into Cedar Hollow on a hired horse with a leather case strapped behind the saddle and took the front room at the hotel and paid for a month. Her name was Gertrude Quillfeather, and she was the most pleasant person that town had seen in years. She called on the commissioners first, then on Hollis, then on the church, where she put $2 in the plate and admired the singing. She said progress, and she said the valley, and she said the whole county will feel it inside of 5 years, and she said all of it in a voice so mild that men leaned in to hear her. She never raised it once. That was the first thing Marilla understood about her, standing in her pew, third from the back on the aisle. Power in that woman did not need volume. On a Thursday, 2 men with a transit and a bundle of lath drove stakes across Marilla's 40 acres. She did not learn it from them. She learned it from a boy in her afternoon class who mentioned that there were surveyors down on the creek bottom, and she kept her chalk moving, and she finished the lesson, and she dismissed them at 4, and then she walked the 3 miles out and stood looking at a line of fresh cedar lath running through her grass like stitching. The notice came the following Monday, handed up her outside stairs by the county clerk, who could not look at her. Petition for condemnation of a strip 400 feet wide, necessary for public use. The company's offer was written at the bottom in a clean hand. It was, near enough, 1/5 of what that ground was worth, and it would take the creek, which meant it would take the water, which meant the rest of it would be 40 acres of dry grass nobody would ever pay $1 for. Hearing before the commissioners 6 weeks out. She read it twice at the plank table by her window. Not a gasp, not a tear, just a woman reading a document the way you read a doctor's face. And then the other thing started, and it was worse, and it did not come from Gertrude Quillfeather at all. It came out of the ordinary machinery of a small town noticing something at last. Somebody had seen wagon tracks in the mud at the bottom of the schoolhouse stairs coming in from the Ford Road twice a week before light. Somebody counted back to the mittens and to a store account nobody had opened. Somebody said the schoolteacher's stove had drawn awfully well all winter for $4 a term. By the second week, it was not a question anymore. It was a phrase, said kindly, the way that valley said everything. A woman being kept. Ada Pruitt came to her at the church supper and put a hand on her sleeve and said, "I only tell you because I am fond of you, and people will talk, and you have your post to think of." Marilla said, "Thank you, Ada." She meant it. That was the terrible part. The woman meant her no harm and had just told her exactly how much ground she stood to lose, and there was still no one to be angry at. 2 nights later, the school board chairman stopped her on the road and mentioned, apropos of nothing, that a teacher's character was the whole of her qualification, and that he assumed there was nothing in it, and that he only wished to be able to say so. So now she could lose the 40 acres and the schoolhouse both. And there was a third thing, which nobody had said out loud, and which she worked out for herself sitting up with a cold lamp at 11 o'clock at night. Duncan Mackenzie had been left standing at an altar once in front of that entire county and had not courted a soul in 4 years, and every soul in the valley knew it. If they made her a kept woman, they made him the fool of it twice over. Stay with her here, because this is where she chose. Tuesday morning at 5, she was on the landing before he came, and she had not made coffee. He came up out of the dark with an armload of pine and stopped 4 steps down. She said, "You cannot come here any more." He stood there with the wood against his chest. She said, "They are saying things, not about me. Well, about me and then about you, and I will not have you standing in the middle of that a second time." He said nothing for a long moment. He said, "I do not much care what they say." She said, "I know, but I do. Not for me, for you." Then she went in and shut the door, and she stood behind it with her hand still on the wood, listening, and she heard him set the armload down on the plank as quietly as a man can set down pine and go back down the stairs. Another small thing she noticed, standing there. He had not argued with her. He had done the thing she asked, which was the cruelest possible obedience. Across town, in the front room of the hotel, Gertrude Quillfeather turned up her lamp, opened her case, and wrote in her book that the Lambert parcel would come clear before the hearing. She had 6 weeks. She did not think she would need them. The armload of pine he set down on the plank that morning lasted her 11 days. She burned it a stick at a time, later in the evening than she needed to, and when the last piece went in, she sat and watched the door of the stove until the light behind the grate went orange and then gray. Then she went to bed. After that, there was nothing on the step. The pail stayed empty. She filled it herself at the town pump and carried it up the outside stairs at 5:30, and it slopped over her skirt on the 3rd stair the way it always had before, and she found she had forgotten that it used to. 3 weeks went by like that. Understand, nothing bad happened in them. The children came. The hinge stayed silent because oil does not know why it was put on. She taught long division, and she heard the boys stumble through the Psalms, and she marked copybooks by lamp until her eyes ached, and every Tuesday and every Friday she woke at 5 out of habit and lay there listening to a road with nothing on it. She used the evenings on the notice. She copied the petition out by hand, twice, once fair, and once with the margins wide so she could write in them. She read the statute the county clerk had cited, the one pinned in a bound volume at the courthouse that no one had asked to see in years, and the clerk let her sit with it on a bench in the hall because she asked so politely that refusing would have taken effort. She wrote out the description of the strip, 400 feet wide, running from a point, thence, thence, thence. Her hand knew the shape of that document better than her mind wanted to admit. On a Saturday, with the creek still up and the cottonwoods just come into leaf, she walked the 3 miles out to her 40 acres with the fair copy folded in her pocket and a pencil to write down where each stake stood in relation to the water. She was on her knees in the grass, measuring off paces to the 3rd lath when the light went. It came out of the northwest, the way everything came. Hail first, small and hard as peas, rattling on the lath and the crown of her hat and the flat of her shoulders. Then the rain, standing up in sheets. Then the dark, at 4 in the afternoon, and thunder walking down the bottom close enough that she felt it in the ground under her knees. She got up and started back, and did not get 80 yards, because Salt Creek had come up brown and shouldering while she had her back to it, and the ford below the bend was already gone. It had gone that morning most likely, and she had crossed on stones that were under 2 feet of water now. She was on the wrong side of it, 3 miles from her own stove, in her teaching dress, in the open. Then she heard a horse. He came down the bottom at a walk, slicker streaming, hat brim bent down flat with the weight of the water on it, and he did not ask her what she was doing out there. He said, "There is a line shack a half-mile up. Roof is half on." That was all. She got her hand on the stirrup leather and walked beside the horse, and he walked too, on the other side, leading it, so that neither of them had to say anything about who would ride. The shack was one room, 12 feet or near it, a rusted stove, a bunk with rope where the slats had been, a door that hung true because someone had rehung it sometime. He had a fire going inside of 4 minutes with shavings off a stick of pine and a dry match out of a tin in his coat. He filled the stove and set her hat on a nail and her shoes on the hearthstone and went back out into it and came in again with his bedroll and a coil of rope. Then he did the thing she thought about for the rest of her life. He ran the rope across that room, corner to corner, wall peg to nail, and over it he hung his slicker and 2 blankets and a canvas pack sheet, and he pulled them along until they met, and there was a wall. He said, "You take the stove side." She said, "And where will you be?" He said, "Under the lean-to with the horse." She said, "The lean-to has no roof." He said, "Been wet before. Watch what she does next." She was a woman who had spent 3 weeks not asking anybody for one single thing. She said, "You will sit inside that door, or I will not sleep at all." He looked at the floor by the doorpost for a moment, the way a man looks at a job he has been given. Then he sat down there, on the boards, his back against the jamb, hat on, boots crossed at the ankle, on the dry side of the threshold, and no farther in. He stayed there all night. He never once came around the blankets. The rain went on. The stove ticked. Somewhere out in the black, the creek was moving whole trees along, and you could hear them knock. And that is where she told him. She told it flat, facing the fire, so she would not have to watch him hear it. There was a front room in Pittsburgh with a brass plate on the door. There was a man in it who read law, and she had been engaged to him for 2 years and 4 months. She copied his deeds in her own hand because her hand was better than his. She copied affidavits. She copied condemnation notices, dozens of them, for a railroad, and she learned what a good one looked like and what a defective one looked like, and why a description that closed on a creek instead of a monument would not hold. And when he took a partnership, he explained to her kindly that a wife who knew a man's business as well as he did was a hard thing to introduce. He said she made a fine clerk. He said it as a compliment. She was 32 years old now, and she had never told a living soul in Cedar Hollow any of it, because a woman who knows too much of a man's trade is not a woman anyone wants at his table. She stopped. The fire popped. She waited for the change in the room. She had felt that change before. Duncan Mackenzie said, "Then there is nothing in that hotel woman's case you have not already read." She turned around. He was looking at the dark outside the door, not at her, and he said, "He was a fool twice. Once for letting you copy it, once for letting you go. Not a speech, not comfort, just a man setting 2 facts down side by side the way he set down pine. And then he told her his, because that is what men like him do. They pay you back in kind and never mention that they are doing it. He said, 4 years back, I stood up in front of this county in a church with my hat in my hand, and she did not come. Nobody was unkind about it. That was the worst of it. They were all so careful with me afterward. He said, I have not asked anybody anything since, so I am not going to ask you anything now. Then he said the rest of it plainly, still looking at the door. I have got a spare room at the North Fork. Been shut since before that. It has a stove that draws and a window on the east. You can have it any day you want it, and there is no arrangement attached to it, and if you never want it, that is all right too. But I am not having you cold or hungry in this valley while I have got a roof standing empty. That is not a courting matter. That is just what a roof is for. Marilla Lambert sat on the floor of a line shack on the wrong side of a flooded creek with a blanket wall behind her, and did not say anything for a long time. Another small thing she noticed. He had not offered her a thing she would have to be grateful for out loud. He had offered it the way he filled the pail. To the level a person can carry, she said, "I cannot take it. Not now. Not with what they are saying." He said, "I know," she said, "but I would like it to stay offered." He said, "It will." In the morning the sky was washed pale and empty, and the creek was down a foot and still no ford. He put her up on the horse and walked at its head the 7 miles around by the bend, the long way, on foot, in the mud, and he did not speak more than 4 times the whole distance. They came up the Cedar Hollow road at 9 in the morning on a Sunday, in front of the church, in front of every wagon in that town. By noon, the whole valley knew, and in the front room of the hotel, Gertrude Quillfeather heard about it before her coffee was cold, and wrote 1 line in her book, in her clean, pleasant hand, and underlined it twice. No husband, no counsel, 4 weeks. She had read a defective description once before, pinned by the door in Hollis's store in February, and stepped back from the wall as if it had burned her. She did not step back this time. She sat at the plank table by her window with the fair copy and the wide margin copy and the bound volume the clerk had let her borrow overnight against his better judgment, and she read the petition for the 9th time, and on the 9th time she found it. The company had not filed under the section for known owners. It had filed under the section written for land whose owner is absent, unknown, or of residence not ascertained. That section did not require an appraisal by 3 freeholders. It did not require the owner to be heard. It required only publication, and publication had been made in a paper printed 90 miles away in the week the mail could not cross the ford. Marilla Lambert put down her pencil and understood, with a clarity that made her cold, exactly how she had been read. A woman with no husband, no family, and no address but a room over a schoolhouse was, on paper, a woman of residence not ascertained. Which is a thing you can only say about a person, and if nobody has ever written down where she lives. So she wrote it down. She was at the courthouse door when the clerk unlocked it. She filed a written appearance in the matter in her own hand. She filed an affidavit of residence, sworn and signed, stating that she had boarded in the room above the Cedar Hollow schoolhouse continuously for 4 years. She filed a certified copy of her patent, pulled from the clerk's own book, the original filing with her name on it in the register's ink. She filed the receipts for 4 years of taxes paid, every one of them kept flat in the back of a Bible. And she filed a demand that any description of the strip close upon a fixed monument and not upon the bank of a creek that moved every spring. The clerk stamped each one and wrote the date and could not look at her again, though for a different reason now. 4 weeks before the hearing, and the ground under the petition was gone. Not loudly, not in front of anyone, just gone. The town turned before the county did, and it did not turn because of any of that. It turned because a mother named on nobody's list, one of the 11, mentioned at the store that her boy's mittens had gray thumbs and a red pair had gone to the Kessler child, and Hollis, who kept the ledger and had kept the account nobody signed for, said, quiet as a man weighing flour, that the schoolteacher had knitted every pair by lamp after her copybooks were marked and had never once said so. Somebody asked who bought them. Hollis said she priced them at 15 cents. She took $1.75 for the table. Work it out. Ada Pruitt worked it out at her own kitchen table and sat there a long while. Then she walked down to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon and waited on the bottom stair until the children came out, and she said, I said a thing over pie plates in October that I would like back. Marilla said, you may have it. Ada Pruitt said, that is not how it works, and went home, and the following Tuesday there was a crock of cream on the step, and after that a Hollis woman brought soap, and Pruitt sent his 2 boys up with a wagon load of dry pine and instructions to stack it under the eave, ends squared, which they did badly and proudly. Another small thing she noticed. Nobody asked her about Duncan Mackenzie anymore. They had decided something without her help, and what they had decided was that a woman who gives away 11 pairs of mittens and lets the town believe they came from nowhere is not a woman being kept. The board chairman found her on the road again and said he had wanted to be able to say there was nothing in it, and that he now could. She thanked him. She did not tell him she had already stopped needing him to. The Saturday before the hearing was market day and church supper both, and half the county stood in the road between the store and the church hall with wagons drawn up along it. Gertrude Quillfeather worked that crowd the way she worked everything, pleasantly, patiently, her leather case under her arm. She spoke about progress. She said the valley. She said the whole county would feel it inside of 5 years, and she said the last unsettled parcel was a small matter of a description, and men leaned in to hear her because she never raised her voice. Then the sheriff came up out of the courthouse with the county clerk beside him, and the clerk had the register book, and the register book was heavy, and he set it down on the tail of Pruitt's wagon where there was light. The sheriff said, "Ma'am, the commissioners asked me to bring this out here where folks are, so it does not have to be said twice." He turned the book. He read the entry. 40 acres of grass and creek bottom, patented in the name of Marilla Lambert, filed and recorded, and he read the date. He set down beside it the tax receipts, 4 of them in order. He set down beside those the appearance and the affidavit of residence, stamped, 4 weeks old, and he read the line about the room above the schoolhouse, continuously 4 years. He set down last the petition itself, and read the section it was filed under, the one written for owners absent, unknown, or of residence not ascertained. Nobody raised a voice. A horse shifted in the traces. Somewhere behind the church hall a child was being made to wash. The clerk said, "The description closes on the creek. The creek moved in April. There is no monument in it. The commissioners cannot condemn, ground the paper cannot find." And the murmur that went along that road was not anger. It was arithmetic. 60 people doing the same small sum at the same time and arriving at the same place. Gertrude Quillfeather said, "The company will of course amend and refile, and the county understands that the schedule of construction." She did not finish it, not because anyone shouted her down. Because Pruitt had already turned back to his sacks, and Hollis had gone in to weigh coffee, and Ada Pruitt had taken Marilla's arm to steer her toward the hall where the supper was, and the sheriff was closing the register book, and there was quite simply nobody left in that road who was listening. She stood there with her case under her arm, and her smile still arranged. Then she walked back up the steps of the hotel. She left inside of 3 days, and the line went around by the ridge the following year, and the valley did feel the progress, and by then hardly anyone in Cedar Hollow could remember her name. Marilla did not watch her go. That is the part to keep. She had every right to stand in that road and say out loud what she had figured out at a plank table by lamplight, and who had tried to do what to her, and how nearly it had worked. She said none of it. She went into the church hall and cut bread, because there were 40 people to feed, and the knife was there. And at the far end of the hall, hat in his hands, hair flattened where the band had been, a man stood in the doorway and did not come in, and she saw him and kept slicing and let him stand there. The wood came back on a Tuesday. She had not asked for it. She came down at 5, and there it was, half a cord, ends squared, tucked under the eave beside the badly stacked pine the Pruitt boys had left, and the pail standing full to 3 inches from the rim, set back in its own worn ring. The creek went down through May. The grass came up over the lath stakes until you had to hunt for them, and then the cottonwoods filled out and you could not find them at all. She rode out to walk her 40 acres in June and stood in it a long while, hearing water that still belonged to her. He came at 5, Tuesdays and Fridays, and they stood on the landing with the tin cups while the light came up earlier and earlier and the coffee stopped being necessary for warmth. And on one of those mornings, he came up the stairs with no wood in his arms at all. He had the folded survey map instead, creased soft as cloth from 11 days in a coat pocket, and he set it on the plank table by her window, and he set his cold cup beside it, and he said the thing he had come to say with his hat still on, the way he said everything. Marry me or don't. Either way, the land stays in your name, and nobody takes the schoolhouse from you. She did not answer him right away, not because she was uncertain, because she wanted to stand inside those 2 sentences a minute longer, in a warm room, in the smell of snowmelt and cut pine coming up off the road. A man had put a roof and 40 acres on a table and taken nothing off it. No conditions, no debt, just the plain arithmetic of a man who fills a pail to the level a person can carry. Then she reached across and took his hand off the map and held it, and it was the first time in 9 months that their hands had not passed each other by half an inch. He took his hat off. She had seen him do that twice before. They married in the fall, in the church, and he stood up front with his hat in his hand, and she came, and she watched him understand that she had come. Ada Pruitt cried. 60 people did the arithmetic and got a different answer than they had in October. She kept teaching. The room at the North Fork with the stove that drew and the window on the east became hers, and she never once had to be grateful out loud for it. The 40 acres stayed in her name, filed and recorded, and the water stayed with the grass. When I think about them now, I do not think about the road or the register book on the tail of that wagon. I think about a woman standing on a cold landing at 6:30 with a washed, empty crock in both hands, laughing out loud once and covering her mouth like a girl in church because somebody had returned a thing to her clean and asked her for nothing. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're listening from and what moment touched you most. Drop a comment and tell me the exact moment you knew she was going to be all right. I read every one of them. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you'd like more quiet evenings, By the Fire, Lonely Roads, Quiet Cowboys, and Hearts Finding Their Way Home, come back for the next one. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.